FM News Talk 97.1. On demand audio.
Joining me now, Democratic Congressman Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. He's the ranking member on the House Budget Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me.
Good to be with you, Tara.
Are you rooting for a government shutdown?
That's absolute nonsense. What's happening today is you have the Tea Party driving the train for the House leadership. And the Tea Party's position is, if we don't get things 100% our way, we want you to shut down the government. And that's what you've got going on right now in the House Republican caucus. Essentially, the Tea Party has taken over the steering wheel, and the leadership is sort of in the back seat. And so we'll have to see how this turns out.
That was Representative Chris Van Hollen, who I also like to say is Nancy Pelosi's puppet. It's not, I mean, that's he just kind of what the guy is. Trying to blame all of the impasse in Congress on the Tea Party movement, which I think is a stretch. And it's a concerted effort by Democrats to try to portray the grassroots movement as being this extreme. You remember Chuck Schumer saying, "Oh, the caucus instructed me." I'm quoting him verbatim. "The caucus instructed me to say extreme or extremist whenever I'm talking about the Tea Party." But that's one of the things that's everyone's discussing. We're watching to see what happens with this looming possibility of a government shutdown with the budget. And we're also going to be discussing Libya, energy, and we're going to open the phone lines up here soon. And joining me in studio right now is Senator Roy Blunt. And good afternoon, sir.
Hey, Dana, I'm glad to be with you.
Yeah, it's
great to be with you here in the studio. And thanks for the good work you're doing every day. Well,
and I appreciate you guys going to battle every single day in D.C. and doing what you have to do. And I know right now it is such a super huge fight. And I think, I realize a lot of people are upset because they think, with the budget and the proposed cuts being $33 billion, I know that a lot of, talking about like grassroots people, they want to see more. And I realize, too, that Republicans, especially in the Senate, are in kind of an odd predicament because a lot of independents, they say that they want spending to be cut, but at the same time, they don't actually want to make the necessary cuts that would achieve the goals that they set in all of the exit polling on November 2nd. And, you're right in the middle of this battle. What is your take on, the $33 billion in cuts, and what are you seeing from being on the inside, your perspective?
Well, I think all of it is just the entry-level discussion to what we really have to do. We're going to spend $3.8 trillion at the federal level, the federal government is this year, and we're going to collect $2.2 trillion. So we've got a $1.6 trillion problem. That's about 30 times as much as the money we're talking about cutting at $60 billion. I'm for cutting $61 billion or $161 billion or whatever we can do. But there are a couple of complications here that are real. One is we're talking about cuts that you've got to make while the government is in motion.
Right.
And we need to do as much of that as we can do, but we really need to get on to the discussion of what the spending year that starts October 1 looks like. This is all of this effort is not only because the majority in the Senate and Democrats in Washington don't have a plan this year that they're willing to talk about. They didn't have a plan last year that they were willing to talk about when they were in charge. And so last year was the first time in the history of the balance of the budget law. We'll talk about balanced budgets later, but the history of the Budget Act that neither house of the Congress passed a budget, and not one single appropriations bill came to the floor of the 12 bills that need to pass for the government to run. And so this is not just about no Democrat plan this year. It's about no plan last year, and now we're having to deal with that when as quickly as we can. We ought to get on with talking about what happens on October 1 in the first full year of these new numbers in Congress, where there's a minority of Republicans in the House, but it's no longer a minority of 40. It's now a minority of 47, and there is a significant majority of Republicans in the Senate, and there's a significant majority of Republicans in the House, and we need to get on with looking at the whole. Everything needs to be looked at. Everything needs to be on the table.
Right.
And we're borrowing $4 billion a day. The White House's first offer of what they thought they might be able to cut in an annual budget was $4.5 billion. So one day's borrowing was the only thing they could find in the whole budget to cut. So, there's clearly not there's not a serious engagement here on the other side,
right?
Yet.
And what fascinates me is how Democrats can balk at cutting $33 billion when they added $1 trillion in spending last year.
Right.
And it's such a tiny amount, and it cracks me up that they think that that's so bad to cut something that small, and that it's taken this long to even get them to kind of warm up to that figure. And then the fact that you mentioned too, they didn't pass a balanced budget last year, but trillions of dollars in spending, and we have they've tripled the deficit since the election.
Yeah, and they passed, again, you made the same comment I did, which was wrong. They didn't pass any budget last year,
right.
Balanced or not.
Nothing.
They refused to put their cards on the table in an election year because they knew what people thought about this out-of-control spending at the federal level. And remember, what we're dealing with now, there's a reason that we're dealing with just the non-defense, basically the non-defense discretionary budget, because that's all you can get to this quickly.
Right.
Because the other budget, you have to actually change the law and redefine whether you have a program or whether people qualify for it or not. And we need to get to that part of this discussion as soon as we can. And I hope we're able to do that with at least $60 billion in savings out of the spending year we're in right now. But it's really important that we get to that
right
big discussion. And by the way, when people say, well, this is only about 12% of the budget, maybe 15 you're taking this money out of. And so it's disproportionate. It's unfair. If you took this same proportion out of the entire budget, you'd still have a $1 trillion annual program.
Right.
If you took this same portion out of the entire budget, you'd just be reducing spending by $600 billion. And remember, we got a $1,600 billion problem, a $1.6 trillion problem. So, of course, it's not disproportional. It's just the beginning discussion we have to have to get the budget back in balance. And I think the balanced budget amendment that I have always supported, that the Senate almost passed, came within one vote of passing in the mid-'90s, has to be part of any ongoing discussion about debt limits or anything else. You can't continue to do what you've been doing and expect to get different results. So I'm certainly opposed to increasing the debt limit unless we change the rules of the game and change them pretty substantially.
Absolutely. Do you think, too, that more...
And that's a second discussion. That's
different.
That's different than keeping...
But it's related, though. Completely.
It's related, and it comes pretty quickly. I'd say by about Memorial Day week, that will be the topic we're dealing with, and then the measuring stick is, okay, have we instituted enough changes to really dramatically change the curve, the cost curve, the spending curve? And if we haven't, we shouldn't increase the debt limit. Right.
When we're going to go to break here in just a second, but when we come back, I want to get to three different things in our last segment before our second hour. I want to ask you really quickly about entitlement reform. Then I want to change it up and get your thoughts on our kinetic military action, as it's called now,
limited
in Libya. Limited in Libya, and we got a couple other things to discuss. But we're going to be right back with Senator Roy Blunt here on the Dana Show. Senator Roy Blunt is joining us in studio, and we're continuing our conversation about the budget. I'm going to ask him about Libya here in a second, but. Senator, when we came into the last segment, we played some audio from Representative Van Hollen, and one of the things that I've noticed from Democrats is they are trying to drive a wedge between the Republicans who are in Washington, D.C., and the Tea Party movement. Now, when you hear people like Van Hollen say, oh, well, it's the Tea Party's fault that we haven't come to an agreement on a budget, what do you say to things like that? Do you think that are they just pushing to try to make more of a divide, to try to make the right vulnerable, or is there any truth to what they're saying?
Well, I think back to our earlier discussion just a few minutes ago. It's the same philosophy that meant no budget last year, no appropriations bill last year. They very much don't want to talk about what they're for right now.
Right.
And so it's all trying to change the subject. There is no Democrat plan. And in fact, John Boehner said it pretty well last week. We said, okay, if they've got a plan, pass it
Right.
and send it over here.
Right.
The Democrats control the Senate. If they got a plan, send it over here and let's look at it. And they don't have a plan except business as usual. That is nowhere nearly acceptable. So they want to talk about everything else. And thank goodness, the Tea Party did what they did last year, and they're doing what they're doing this year to continue to call attention to the fact that this cannot continue. This cannot go on like that. And you and I have talked about this before, Dana. In 2005, and I led this fight the last time we cut the entitlement programs, the only
Right.
time in a decade, and nobody was calling in except the people who were supporting the programs.
Exactly.
Nobody.
Exactly.
There was no Tea Party in 2005, and we made those $40 billion in cuts.
And that's where the biggest of it is in entitlements.
That is where most of the money is. In fact, this year, for the first time in the history of the country, that $2.2 trillion number I mentioned, the money we collected this year, we spent a little more than that on entitlements.
Good grief.
So everything else we did, every bullet we bought for a soldier's weapon, every military uniform we bought, every national park that opened the front gate, all of that, every Pell Grant, all of that was done with borrowed money.
Oh,
so we're now defending the country with borrowed money. We're doing, and these entitlements have to be they have to be a big part of the discussion, and it's not always how do you reduce benefits. Some of it is going to be how do you get better results for less money.
Absolutely.
That's what everybody else in America has talked about in a competitive economy for 20 years. How do we produce a better product for less than we're spending right now? And they have done that. But the government still acts like it's an analog government in a digital world where maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's a telegraph government in a digital world.
Right.
And it's time the government has to be like everybody else. And some of this is stopping doing what we're doing. Some of it is doing what we're doing a lot more thoughtfully, a lot more effectively, and getting more focused on results and not just trying to prove how much we care about something based on how much we spend on it.
Right. And I want to switch it up and ask you about Libya. A lot of criticism flying at the White House because of the actions that the president took in Libya. Now, look, I realize that past presidents, both Republican and Democrat, not everyone has gone and gotten congressional authorization in order to do what the president did. My criticism stems from the fact that he campaigned on that. He was very critical of the Iraq War. But at the same time, he's essentially, I think, practicing the Bush doctrine in Libya. How are the Republicans in the Senate reacting to what I think is a completely mismanaged affair in Libya, especially since we don't even know who the rebel forces are. And now we're hearing, according to Abdel al-Hasidi, who's the head of the Libyan rebel force, that yes, al-Qaeda is not only connected to these fighters, that they're actually fighting alongside these rebel forces.
Well, of course, he would say that, and I don't know how true that is. I'm on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and we have these meetings. And think about this. If you're him, of course that's what you'd say. And we're trying to determine how much truth there really is to that.
Right.
But obviously that's what he would say. He would say that if it was true or not, because you would want it to seem to the Islamic world that if there is some movement in Libya or anywhere else, radical Islam must be at the middle of it. So of course he would say that. That doesn't mean it's true. And whatever doctrine the president's pursuing here, he's not pursuing it very well, or very consistently. And you saw this in Egypt. Now we're seeing in Libya at an even higher level, where one day it's Gaddafi must go, and the next day but we're only doing this for humanitarian reasons. And I don't really even know what that means. If Gaddafi is left in control of Libya, the same numbers of people that would have died last week are likely to die 6 months from now.
Right.
This is an evil guy. Now maybe this is a different argument than whether we should be there or not. But the President of the United States cannot say things like Gaddafi must go and that be meaningless.
Exactly. But we're not going to use military means. Well, when you start firing off $1.5 million Tomahawk missiles at his forces, it kind of seems like you're taking sides.
Well, it does, Dana. And I got to tell you, I'm very concerned about this. I was a little less concerned in Egypt because I thought, okay, learning curve, should have been ready for this. Disappointed he was. I mean, Hosni Mubarak was 82 years old. There should have been some plan of what happens whenever he's no longer there,
right,
and the 3 or 4 things that could happen and how we'd react to all of them. But when it's Egypt and he's saying one day Mubarak must go, and the next day he's literally saying, but not too quick, and the next day he said, no, he needs to go right now. That's troublesome. But a month and a half later, when we're still in that kind of stumbling foreign policy discussion and international discussion in Libya, that's dangerous for the friends of the United States of America.
It absolutely is. Senator Roy Blunt, we appreciate the work that you do in Washington, D.C. Thanks for coming in and talking to us in studio today.